Well, I'm happy to report that Sarah Jade and I have discovered the best sandwich in Niagara. Now, I'll warn you, it's entirely unaffordable. We had to take out a second mortgage just to be able to share one, but it was totally worth it. In the heart of Pelham is a coffee shop that serves a chicken shawarma sandwich. Savory shawarma, seasoned chicken, smoked pineapple, hot sauce aioli, and crunchy pickled red cabbage, all served on fresh, store-baked focaccia bread. It is to die for. Well, as we continue and actually conclude today our journey through the middle portion of the book of Acts, we come to a story that's kind of like a sandwich, a spicy slab of story wedged between two thin slices of side story. This is actually a common narrative device used by the author Luke, who wrote the Gospel of Luke and then its sequel, the book of Acts, a meaty text that he bookends between a side story that at first glance seems as unrelated as a hunk of roast beef and a loaf of French bread, but in the end come together like peanut butter and jelly. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to examine the bread story and the meat story separately, and then we're going to put the whole thing together to see how they feed off each other. And I'm going to warn you, I'm going to use a lot of food puns today. And because every good sandwich begins with delicious sliced bread, we're going to start with the bread story first, the story that begins and ends our text. So if you're going to follow along in your Bible, you can turn to Acts chapter 11. We're beginning in verse 27. We read this, that during this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch, and one of them, named Agabus, stood up and through the Spirit predicted that a severe famine would spread over the entire Roman world. The disciples, as each one was able, decided to provide help for the brothers and sisters living in Judea. And this they did, sending their gift to the elders by Barnabas and Saul. Now, you may remember that the book of Acts and the story of the church begins in Jerusalem. But as the persecution, the kind we learned about in the story of Stephen, as it grew much, much worse and very severe, the center of gravity of the church shifted to the city of Antioch, a large metropolitan and multi-ethnic city that was considered at that time to be the greatest city in the world next to Rome. And when the Antioch church learned of the coming famine, they immediately began to be concerned not with how this would impact them, but how it would affect the precarious Jesus community in Jerusalem. It was already being ravenously devoured by persecution and was likely to face high levels of discrimination were there to be any kind of food relief program. And so they gathered together some food and some finances, and they sent this care package along with Saul, which is the Jewish name of the Apostle Paul, and his ministry traveling companion, Barnabas. That's how our first story begins. That's the first slice of bread in our story sandwich. And if we zoom ahead about a chapter, at the end of chapter 12, we come to the second corresponding slice of bread, the story that ends our text today. In Acts 12:25, we read that when Barnabas and Saul had finished their mission, they returned from Jerusalem, taking with them John, also called Mark. Paul and Barnabas return home, having delivered life-saving relief to the famine-starved people in Jerusalem, bringing a new travel companion with them. It's a beautiful slice of life in the early church, marked by empathy, compassion, and selfless generosity. But as stories go, in sandwich terms, this one's a little thin and bland. We need some meat on this bun, and fortunately, Luke inserts in between these two stories, between the time when Barnabas and Paul go to Jerusalem and when they come back, Luke tells us another, much more flavorful story. At the beginning of Acts chapter 12, we read this. It was about this time that King Herod arrested some who belonged to the church, intending to persecute them. And he had James, the brother of John, put to death with the sword. Now, there are about half a dozen King Herods in the Bible. The Herod family, or dynasty to be precise, were ethnically and religiously Jewish, but Roman citizens by birth, uniquely positioning them to be able to rule over the people of Judea on behalf of Rome while maintaining good relationships on both sides. Now, this particular King Herod was Herod Agrippa, and he was a deeply insecure and egotistical, self-absorbed man who desperately craved the approval of the Jewish people and especially their leaders. And seeing how much they hated the church, he decides to score some quick and easy political points with them by persecuting the Christians and even killing James, one of Jesus' original 12 disciples. Now, Luke doesn't say much about the death of James, but church history actually preserves the story that the soldier who was assigned to guard James before his execution was so deeply impacted by James's witness and testimony about Jesus that he too declared himself a Christian and was willingly executed alongside James. And pretty inspiring stuff. That said, Herod wasn't all that impressed by that. When Herod saw that this met with approval among the Jewish people, he proceeded to seize Peter also. This happened during the festival of unleavened bread, and after arresting Peter, he put him in prison, handing him over to be guarded by 4 squads of 4 soldiers each. Herod intended to bring him out for public trial after the Passover. So Peter was kept in prison, but the church was earnestly praying to God for him. When Herod, who was driven by his lust for praise and popularity and approval, realized that the killing of James had made him kind of a national hero of sorts, he set his sights on an even bigger target, the Apostle Peter, who was the top official of the church at that time. And this time, he would hold a public trial, a publicity stunt, to boost his ratings even more. So he has Peter arrested, and he stations 16 soldiers to guard him, perhaps to avoid what had happened to James's guard. In any case, whatever the reason, Herod wasn't taking any chances. He wanted Peter dead. Now, Luke tells us that all of this happened during the Festival of Unleavened Bread, which is an annual 7-day festival that culminates in the Passover meal, a meal of lamb and flatbread and spices and sauces. The Passover meal commemorates the deliverance that God did for Israel when they were enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt, when he freed them from their slavery. Not coincidentally, this was the exact same meal that Jesus had as his Last Supper before his own trial and execution. And these are not just incidental details. Luke wants us to have these stories and images lingering in our imagination as we read this story. So with death and deliverance lingering in our minds, Luke reminds us that the church was praying for Peter. And he goes on to say that the night before Herod was to bring him to trial, Peter was sleeping between 2 of the soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries stood guard at the entrance. Suddenly, an angel of the Lord appeared, and a light shone in the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him up. "Quick, get up," he said. And the chains fell off Peter's wrists. Then the angel said to him, Put on your clothes and sandals, and Peter did so. "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me," the angel told him. Peter followed him out of the prison, but he had no idea that what the angel was doing was really happening. He thought he was seeing a vision. They passed the first and second guards and came to the iron gate leading to the city. It opened for them by itself, and they went through it. And when they had walked the length of one street, suddenly the angel left him. And Peter came to himself and said, "Now I know without a doubt that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me from Herod's clutches and from everything the Jewish people were hoping would happen." In a scene reminiscent of Israel's delivery out of Pharaoh's hands in Egypt, Peter is saved from Herod's sinister plot. Now, as a timeout, there's kind of a side question that is raised here as to why God chose to save Peter, but not James. Why God sometimes seems to act and at other times doesn't. Why some cancer gets miraculously cured and others doesn't. Why some hear the voice of God and others only deafening silence. You can scan the scriptures, but no answer is provided. It's a mystery that leaves our hearts aching for the redemption of all things and the undoing of pain, sorrow, and suffering. And in the meantime, invites us to trust in God. Back to the story. In the morning, Luke says, there was no small commotion among the soldiers to what had become of Peter. After Herod had a thorough search made for him and did not find him, he cross-examined the guards and ordered that they be executed. Peter's escape made Herod look weak and incompetent. He was embarrassed. He was furious. So he lashed out at the soldiers who had been guarding Peter, as a way of reasserting his power and dominance by the tip of the blade of his sword. And 16 innocent lives are sacrificed on the altar of Herod's ego. But Herod wasn't finished yet. It says, then Herod went from Judea to Caesarea and stayed there. He had been quarreling with the people of Tyre and Sidon. They now joined together and sought an audience with him. After securing the support of Blastus, a trusted personal servant of the king, they asked for peace because they depended on the king's country for their food supply. The ancient cities of Tyre and Sidon, which is modern-day Lebanon, heavily depended on import and trade with neighboring nations for their economy, much like we do today. And with Judea being a major trade partner, Herod was in a position to put immense negotiation pressure on these cities. Worse, because they depended so heavily on trade with Judea for their food supply, Herod could literally starve them into submission if he wanted to. Worse still, as the reader, we know that famine is coming, and so the stakes couldn't be higher. And so wisely, the people of Tyre and Sidon decide to do whatever they can to settle whatever quarrels Herod seems to have with them. Luke goes on saying that on the appointed day, the day they were going to have this peace negotiation, Herod, wearing his royal robes, sat on his throne and delivered a public address to the people. Herod, wearing his royal robes, was dressed to impress. In fact, a local historian from that time period actually describes this event. He says that Herod put on a garment made wholly of silver and of a contexture truly wonderful. And he came into the theater early in the morning, at which time the silver of his garment, being illuminated by the fresh reflection of the sun's rays upon it, shone out after a surprising manner and was so resplendent as to spread a horror over those that looked intently upon him. Lady Gaga, eat your heart out. Herod wants his moment in the spotlight. The throne that he sits on is called the judgment seat. It's the throne where the kings of Judea would issue decrees and pass judgment. Herod is about to decide the fate of the people of Tyre and Sidon. And while we're not told what he says, his motives are clear. Killing James had gotten him the glory and adoration that he so desperately craved. And while he'd failed to deliver a repeat performance with Peter, the table was now set for him to make a demonstration of his absolute power over life and death. He alone would decide whether the people of Tyre and Sidon would live or die, whether they would eat or starve. He relished the moment and savored the feeling. In his mind, he was a god. Now, for a moment, just put yourself in the sandals of the people of Tyre and Sidon. What would you do? Well, it seems that they coordinated a response, and together, Luke says, they shouted, "This is the voice of a god, not a man." Now, this is not genuine adoration. They are blowing proverbial smoke up his you-know-what. They would have said or done anything to feed his oversized ego, just to have the chance to feed their families. With his insatiable craving for praise and approval, his bottomless hunger for status and significance, his bloodthirsty appetite for power, and an ego overstuffed with self-importance. Herod might as well have been their god. Without him, they would die. But it wasn't their death that was on the menu that day. Luke says, immediately, Because Herod did not give praise to God, an angel of the Lord struck him down, and he was eaten by worms and died. Rather than denouncing their blasphemy, Herod claims in his heart the glory that only God deserves and is immediately struck dead. Now, history claims that it was only food poisoning, but consider this. Herod, who thought he was a god because he could withhold food from starving people, became himself food for worms, eaten so that others could eat. He thought his actions would bring him honor, but instead he became a horror. He had taken prideful pleasure in playing God, but God was not playing around. There, as he sat upon the judgment seat, he found himself on the receiving end of divine judgment, because what Herod didn't seem to understand was that true power is not the ability to take life, but to give it. Luke wraps up the meat portion of this story sandwich by saying, the word of God continued to spread and flourish. It's a fitting epilogue to the story. While the corpse of Herod festered, the body of Christ flourished. Okay, it's sandwich making time. What do you notice that links these two stories? Hunger, right? A lack of food, the threat of starvation, famine, and even death. That's the similarity that binds these two stories. The difference, which is where the lesson for us lives, the difference is in the arrogant, stingy, withholding, self-centered approval and status-seeking, Lord, my power over you portrayal of Herod, contrasted with the quiet, humble, empathetic, selfless, giving, compassionate, non-silver costume wearing, others-oriented love and generous service that characterizes the church. And the question for us is, which of these two descriptions describes us? I mean, few of us, of course, are going to be in a position like Herod to hold so many lives in our hands. And yet every day our words, actions, attitudes, and behaviors can either serve to nourish hungry souls with dignity, compassion, comforting care, healing, and hope, or they can be stingy and arrogant, withholding, self-seeking, prideful and attention-grabbing, win at all cost and starved of love. Every day our lives either bring life to the people around us or take it. We are either the emergency spiritual famine relief that shows up to bring the life-giving, thirst-quenching, soul-satisfying love of Jesus to people, or we are too focused on our own selves, our own stuff, too busy with our own bloated schedules to bother to take someone out for coffee or share a meal with somebody who can't advance our social standing. Too invested in climbing the ladder of success to consider maybe downgrading our standard of living a little in order to upgrade someone else's quality of life a lot. And too focused on our wants to think of others' needs. Addicted to a steady diet of likes, shares, and follows that we portray this gourmet life, even though it's all mostly just baloney, and we starve the people in our lives of our love, care, and attention. See, sin lies and tells us that we can find fulfillment and satisfaction by feeding our own ego, by focusing on serving our own interests at the expense of others. But the life of Herod exposes this as a death trap. And while we're probably not going to be struck dead on the spot, following the way of Herod will lead to a kind of death that rots us from the inside out, that eats away at our soul like worms, that leaves our hearts spoiled and our relationships decomposing. But Acts 11 and 12 presents us with a different story, an alternative, better vision for life, a life spent serving God by serving those in need, rather than trying to play God by serving only our own interests. A life that contributes to the flourishing rather than the festering. With all that Luke has jammed into this fully loaded double-decker sandwich of a story, I actually left out one ingredient in the first story. Remember the bread story about the Church of Antioch and their famine relief mission? In Acts chapter 11, verse 26, Luke tells us that the disciples were called Christians first at Antioch. It's here in this context, in this story, where the word Christian first appears. And while I confess that I actually don't really use the word Christian to describe myself, mostly because it's become so synonymous with political ideologies that have nothing to do with following Jesus, in our culture, the word Christian has just got such negative connotations. The irony is that when it was originally used, it was actually an insult. It was a derogatory term used to mock followers of Jesus for being little Christs, which is what Christian means. It's kind of like how when my 7-year-old is being a bird brain and Sarah Jade says, "Oh, he's such a little Tom." Outsiders, even those who despised the church, they couldn't help but notice that these people lived and looked an awful lot like Jesus. The resemblance was kind of uncanny. Like Jesus, they were humble and selfless and sacrificial and servant-hearted, things that were not considered virtues at that time. They put other people's needs ahead of their own and practiced a life of quiet, humble service to others, deeply steeped in the teachings and the presence of Jesus, who said of himself that the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. It's like Jesus, who believed it was better to die for your enemies than to kill them. Like him, the early church understood that real power doesn't come from the ability to take life, but to give it. Not from the ability to elevate yourself, but to lift others up. Not from the ability to pass judgment on people, but to extend mercy and grace. And this heart exemplified by the Antioch church is reflected later in the writings of the Apostle Paul to other fledgling churches, where he writes things like, "Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit. Rather, in humility, value others above yourselves, not looking to your own interests, but each of you to the interests of the others. In your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who, being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant." Paul is actually quoting here one of the earliest surviving Christian hymns, which just goes to show how highly they valued humility and servant-heartedness. And it's got me wondering, to what degree have I elevated status over service in my life? And what would it look like to embrace self-lowering servanthood as a core value, maybe the core value of my life, and maybe even of our church? To be known not for the quality of our church services, but for the consistency of our church's service. As we serve meals to people experiencing food insecurity, or offer friendship to those suffering from homelessness and addiction, or a home away from home family to those who are living abroad as migrant workers here in Niagara. Or as we work together for truth and reconciliation with Indigenous people who have been the victims of such injustice, despite being the very siblings and neighbors that Jesus has called us to love and to serve. This is the kind of service that's not just occasional, haphazard, sporadic, once a month, or, at the holidays when it kind of feels good. Service isn't a one-time thing. It's a way of life. It's the way of Jesus, who invites us to join him in becoming a new kind of human, the very best and truest version of ourselves as we were created to be. In the very beginning of the Bible, in the Genesis creation story where people are created, we read that God took the human and settled them in the Garden of Eden to work it and to take care of it. That word work in the original Hebrew is the word abad, which literally means to serve. Meaning that from the very beginning, even in the ideal conditions of Eden, God placed humanity on earth to serve it. Taking the nature of a servant isn't a downgrade or the temporary result of sin or byproduct of living in a broken world. Serving is humanity at its finest. And as we turn to the Bible's final chapter and peer into our collective future, we see that Revelation chapter 22 says, "No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and his servants will serve him." You see, serving is not just our creation calling, it's our eternal destiny, the occupation from which we will never retire. From Eden to eternity, God is inviting us into a life of humble, selfless, you first, love-soaked, Jesus-shaped service. So what about you? As you survey your own life and relationships, think about your friendships, your family, maybe your marriage or your parenting, how you show up to work or school, or even how you show up here to church. These days, are you showing up to be served or to serve? To consume or to contribute? To be included or to become an includer? To have a voice or to be a listening ear? To take center stage or to serve quietly behind the scenes? Are we the kinds of people who push our way to the head of the line, grab the best parking spot, only participate in things that appeal to my interests or advance my agenda? Or are we learning to embrace a small fish in a big pond, faithful to Jesus, life of service, with no fanfare, no demands, no expectations that things are going to have to go my way? In other words, are we increasingly becoming a community of little Christs? This journey through the middle portion of Acts has been really challenging and inspiring for me. As we have looked at the stories of the early church, it's invited us to consider the story of us, to reflect on the degree to which, like in the story of Stephen, I'm following in the way of Jesus to the degree that it might actually get me in trouble. Or if, like in the story of Simon the sorcerer, are we embracing the way of Jesus for the perks or for the person? Or if, like in the story of Saul, whether we are allowing the way of Jesus to choose everyone and change everything for us? Or like we learned last week in the story of Peter, are we allowing the way of Jesus to shape an "it's not about me" mentality as we widen the table to make room for everybody, maybe especially those we find hard to love? And as we come to the conclusion of this middle portion of Acts and we land on the story of Herod, we are invited to reject the way of Herod and once again embrace the way of Jesus, of humble, selfless, sacrificial, loving service. It's the story of the middle portion of Acts. It's the story of the early church, and the only question is, will it be the story of us? Now, before I devour this sandwich, I want to invite you to hear from a guy named Shane Claiborne. Shane Claiborne is an American author and activist, and he's actually got a bit of a history with our church family. And he's going to be with us this Wednesday night at our St. Catharines location. We'd love for you to join us and hear what Shane has to say. But as a bit of a sneak preview, Shane sent us this little clip to share with us some of the ways that he has been processing his own journey with Jesus. So as the band comes forward and we prepare to respond with a song, let's hear what Shane has to say.